Good afternoon. I'm your host, Gary Alfonso. Today we're confronting a grave national crisis, one that has steadily eroded the progress we've made towards building a truly constitutional, just and safe society. Gender-based violence and femicide, once described as South Africa's second pandemic during COVID-19, has now been officially recognized as a national disaster at the highest level of government. And rightly so. For far too long, the crisis has claimed lives, destroyed families, and crippled our nation's economy. It demands an urgent, united response because its impact reaches into every community, every sector, and every household in the country. On Thursday, the 20th of November 2025, at the G20 Social Summit, President Cyril Ramaphosa declared gender-based violence and femicide a national disaster. The following day, as world leaders converged in Johannesburg for the G20 summit, thousands of women across South Africa participated in the women's shutdown to honor the women killed daily and withdrawing their economic participation to demonstrate their value. Their timing was deliberate, and one of the billboards in Johannesburg stated it plainly. Welcome to the country where women are only safe in a casket. Let's be clear about what we're facing. Every 3 hours, a woman is murdered in South Africa. Every single day, at least 15 women lose their lives due to violence, and 117 women report rape to police stations across the country. These aren't just statistics. These are our mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends. Between July and September of this year alone, 957 women were murdered. In that same 3-month period, over 10,000 rapes were reported. 1,567 women survived attempted murders, and more than 14,000 experienced assaults causing grievous bodily harm. The latest crime statistics reveal that femicide has surged by nearly 34% compared to the previous year, with almost 5,580 women and 1,660 children killed between April 2023 and March 2024. More than half of all South African women, 51%, report having experienced gender-based violence in their lifetime. Our femicide rate is 5 times higher than the global average, 5 times. But this crisis extends beyond the devastating human cost. Gender-based violence and femicide is strangling our economy. A KPMG report estimates that GBVF costs South Africa between 28 and 42 billion rand annually. That's up to 1.3% of our entire GDP. To put that in perspective, this is the equivalent of employing an additional 200,000 primary school teachers for a year, or providing national health insurance to a quarter of our population. Despite the government's commitment to addressing this crisis through the National Strategic Plan on GBVF, the violence continues to escalate. An estimated 95% of rape cases go unreported, meaning the true scale of this emergency may be far worse than we know. President Ramaphosa's declaration of GBVF as a national disaster is a significant step. It elevates GBVF to a top-tier priority, demanding urgent, coordinated action across all spheres of government, civil society, the private sector, and communities. But as countless civil society organizations and activists have made it clear, declarations must be followed up by action. Today's conversation brings us to a pivotal question. What does a disaster declaration mean for a crisis that has shaped the daily lives of women for generations? How do we move from declaration to action, and what will it take to truly accelerate progress? Our panelists will unpack the role of meaningful partnerships and reflect on South Africa's experience as members of the G20 Empowerment of Women Working Group and the lessons it offered. We'll also confront the tough question: do we have the courage, the coordination, and the sustained investment required to turn our shared vision, ending GBVF in our lifetime, into a lived reality? To discuss this with me, I'm joined in studio by, first of all, the Deputy Minister in the Presidency for Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities, the Honourable Mmapaseka Steve Letsike. Welcome. Thanks for joining us, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation.
Also, Mr. Yu, the Unfpa Country Director.
Thank you, Gary.
And Ms. Faith Kanyile, Board Chairperson of the Gender-Based Violence and Femicide Response Fund. Thank you very much for joining us, ladies and gentlemen. So I think if we can start with you, Honourable Minister, Deputy Minister, when we look at the G20 and the message that the President, the declaration, the fact that GBVF is in there, and then subsequently the announcement that it is now a national priority, if not a national disaster, at least a priority uppermost in their minds. What are the things in terms of resource allocation, in terms of action, departmental coordination and implementation that needs to be considered now and becomes the priority now?
You know, Gary, I think first, I mean, this classification and the pronouncement by President happened during G20 period, or South Africa hosting G20, and it was indeed at the Social Summit. The classification is really, you know, evoked from the National Disaster Management Act, which really assigns, you know, sections of that act that speaks about how we manage a crisis, how we also manage. So you have to look at both classification, a crisis and a classification of a disaster. And currently, because you have not had this under the disaster, you have to classify it. So the pronouncement, and we need to make sure that South Africans understand this, it's under Section 23 that assigns that you immediately have to mobilize resources, deal with coordination at all levels, national, provincial, including local levels, where there's proper coordination, partnership, and as well as resource allocation. Whereas as a disaster, you would have to evoke regulations. Now, what is it? Because we are talking about a most important topic, gender-based violence, which often happens in homes, it happens in society. Homes are not regulated, so you cannot evoke any regulations. And we have to understand it. It's unlike when you're dealing with what happens in the street. The bylaws are affected and so forth. So you have to then classify it and look at some of the aspects around prevention efforts, family supports, shelters, collaboration with building a society that cares, but also you have to do it in a survivor-centered approach. First, prevent it, but those who are exposed to vulnerability and even these kind of incidents that are reported must have proper care and support, and that is affirmative. And that is why this classification by President Ramaphosa is important. Every society, every government, every partner must chip in to resolve the issue of gender-based violence.
Mr. Yu, perhaps if I can come to you, from a global perspective, how significant is it that gender-based violence and femicide has now been declared in this declaration as a national disaster and something for G20 members to take forward? As the Unfpa, you address many issues around the world. How does this resonate with some of the other global players? And from that perspective, you know, what is it that this signaling from South Africa perhaps means from a Unfpa perspective also in how to address this going forward?
Yeah, thank you, Gary. I think absolutely it's significant. In our line of work, fighting against gender-based violence, political will and political leadership is key because it elevates the matter as a priority, and it also calls for and mobilizes the whole of government approach towards addressing the issue, and also unlock financing, which is critical for the fight. Therefore, we really congratulate South Africa, you know, for that leadership in the platform in G20, prioritizing gender-based violence as a key subject to be discussed. And this shows global solidarity and call for investment, international investment, and also it benchmarks a bold actions for all member states to join the fight. Because of that, I think as a Unfpa, as we work with member states very closely, so we look forward to implementing those actions derived from the announcement and declaration.
Faith, we're going to come back to you from the GBVF response fund in a second, but if Deputy Minister, if I can just quickly check, you've referred to this, or it's been referred to in circles as an economic challenge as well. So gender-based violence as an economic challenge. Where is it that this needs to be addressed in society and understood as the economic issue that you know, that is actually core and central to some gender-based violence issues in communities?
Indeed, Gary, I think we have to understand that we don't just deal or respond to gender-based violence as just a social issue. It's economic, but it's also political to some extent. You know, and I think when we look deeper to the issue of economy because it's complex. First, you have to deal with inequalities. It's power issues, power dynamics. You know, who has the means of productions, even worse, in society, but also in homes. But also, you have to deal with it from understanding patriarchy and misogyny that is at play, that the economic hand, that hand that feeds you, would even dictate how you are objectified or weaponized for that matter. And this is why when you look at gender-based violence, how many people does it affect? At the majority, it affects a lot of women. But it also affects a lot of children, that violence against children, because we've weaponized the bodies and we want control, total control. But some of the things it's really about, you know, at the extent when you're saying economy, is that when a woman gets violated, she's the first one who has to leave the house. She's the first one who has to look for a shelter. She's the first one to drop out of work. You know, or even opportunities. But while the perpetrator enjoys the privilege of having the house, having work, continuing like nothing is of problem. And so the economic aspect of it is that we then have to restore the dignity of women. But how you do it prior. You don't only do it because somebody has been violated. And this will then speak about some of the you know, the policies that we have to look into. How do we then address the issues around the macroeconomic policies that focuses on women's ownership of property, women's empowerment, but also that you know, that you address a kind of a whole aspect of economic empowerment and economic justice for women, but also for men. And then when you speak about children, which is a complete total disarray here, that we then have to speak about the protection aspect and their development that is quite important. I mean, just 2 days ago we have hosted a ending teenage pregnancy in South Africa, and we understand the economic aspect, not only just about whether the child aspect, you know, in terms of access, but it also speaks to whether we're dealing with some of the GDP implication. You spoke about the KPMG report. We spend up to 45 billion annually to respond to gender-based violence, which is some money that we need to actually inject in our economic growth. So that economic implication is huge around ownership, the means of production, but also the development and our economic growth.
Since 2021, the GBVF Response Fund has really touched more than 1 million lives through its actions, and the way it's gone about it is the fund is almost described as a blueprint for the correct way that consolidates resources from government, the private sector, all the different stakeholders. How does this multi-stakeholder system, you know, how do we improve it in practice? How do you implement it in practice, and what governance structures are necessary? Because of a problem this size, surely, you know, managing it takes a lot of accountability and responsibility.
No, thanks again, Gary, for having me today. So just some background on the fund. Yeah, you're correct. I mean, the fund was established by President Ramaphosa in 2021, following the call from civil society and human rights activists to really deal with gender-based violence decisively. So the International Women's Forum decided to be the catalyst, you know, for the formation of the fund, obviously supported by the presidency and the Ministry for Women. So from the beginning, we decided that the board of the fund has to be inclusive, has to represent not just the business sector, which was obviously instrumental in providing funding, you know, to the fund, but we made sure that we have civil society, we have activists, and we also have young leaders, men and women. So, and then we decided that first of all we needed the fund to fundraise, you know, so we had to fundraise, so we were able to secure significant funding initially. And then we decided that we're going to deploy this funding to community-based organization in hotspot areas where, gender-based violence really, is most prevalent and devastating. So that is exactly what, we did, Gary. So the fund is really a blueprint for how public-private partnerships can work, but also for how civil society and men and women can play a role in addressing gender-based violence.
Mr. Minister, perhaps looking at how the fund operates, what are the lessons learned in the public-private partnership approach to this response fund, but also maybe specifically, and how do we look at accelerating progress? Because one of the really, I don't want to call it strange, but a 123-year plan, it seems it seems almost impossible to grasp, but it really, if for everything to flow, it's almost like a roadmap to a perfect world, but we need a perfect world earlier.
Yeah, and indeed you're right. This is why young people don't have the patience to wait. 123 years to reach gender parity, it's a long time. And you can be concerned about how many generations it will require to get there. And I think we have to even have a sense of appreciation. When women marched in 1956, calling for, past laws to be, abolished and so forth, you could already see there was no patience. We wanted gender equality. But what are some of the lessons that we pick up from, the private public partnership? First, it's a sense of appreciation that people care, public and private sector. And I think, like Mr. Yu has said, that the political will is there. First, our constitution makes it possible for us to look into partnerships that matter. Secondly, we have a government administration that invests domestically. So you are not only just expecting funds from outside, there's domestic resources that are being invested for social protection, for economic empowerment. And when President pronounced gender-based violence as a second pandemic since COVID-19, you already saw private sector coming in on board to saying, count us in. We want to see change, because once we have a healthy population, you will have a healthy economy, no doubt. And we think it must be scaled up. It must be scaled up because we know that private sector, public sector, but communities will benefit from it. But it must be in that way that it goes into communities to respond to some of the gaps that exist. Already the investment from government that goes to social development, basic education, justice, and even additionally, there is what we call Kara Fund, which is resources that are obtained from those who would commit crime and they get out of bail and so forth. It goes into Kara Fund, and this is a reinvestment to respond to justice, security of our country. So we know that this is possible to invest in communities, to look at psychosocial support, family support, protection network, safe spaces, but also shelter networks to expand on the capacity of social protection.
Mr. Yu, there's obviously, from certain quarters, a lot of global momentum to address gender-based violence and infemicide. And along with Sweden, you've developed or launched the Catalyst initiative, which was aimed at looking at behavioral change and also CEO accountability around GBV. And so what do you think are the specific commitments that we're asking from CEOs watching this stream or broadcast and saying that make action beyond signing something of importance?
Yes, that initiative you mentioned is actually in Bangladesh, launched by Unfpa in partnership with the Swedish government. And there are two elements which is very important. One is champion positive masculinity, and one is the business participation. Actually, both are championed and led by South Africa, if I may say. Therefore, Unfpa pays great attention to partnership. And actually, in January this year, we launched we call it Coalition for Reproductive Justice in Business. And that is one of the platforms to showcase the role of business in champion and leading and delivering services for survivors and youth in particular, and young girls. And in the middle of this year, in Kenya, we launched a Africa Hub for Women Collective X. It is a partnership platform actually dedicated to providing generating solutions with the private business sector along with other stakeholders in women's health, and especially intersecting the sexual reproductive health and rights issues with gender-based violence. So it's a very powerful partnership we believed in, and actually we have lived experience on the table with the GBVF fund, which actually we collaborate very closely. And I'm happy to share the Mauritius Business Association visited the GBVF fund this year. And as a result, they actually modeled the experience of GBVF fund in South Africa, launched their own private sector business collaboration or a coalition against gender-based violence. So these are a few examples I can share with you how business sector really champion lead that. And from the UN perspective, we therefore focus very much on South-South and triangular cooperation, try to bring the experience and knowledge together so that the member states learn from each other and can replicate in their business sector.
Faith, the Response Fund has really has launched an incredible instrument called the Private Sector Coalition, and it's grounded in true zero tolerance in the workplace.
Yes.
Can you perhaps give us a few examples of what it is that that commitments companies are making, and what are some of the things that are required from them, and that they commit to and are readily, which basically showcases their commitment and 100% support behind this campaign?
Yeah, so this campaign, the Private Sector Coalition campaign, is basically a social compact between the fund and other critical players in the private sector. And we're calling actually the private sector to be agents of change and not just to treat gender-based violence as a CSI initiative. And I'm not disrespecting CSI initiatives, but we really want the gender-based violence policies to be entrenched in the company. So we want GBV to be on the agenda, for example, of the Social and Ethics Committee. And we also would like companies, to allocate, funding to initiatives that will empower, victims and survivors of gender-based violence through their social investment initiatives, through their enterprise development initiatives. I think, Gary, earlier on you mentioned that the cost of gender-based violence in the economy and business obviously is directly impacted by that, is close to 45 billion rand. We want to flip that script because actually we need to be saying if companies invest in policies that encourages the ending gender-based violence in the workplace, we will add close to 45 billion rand in our economy. So you know what I mean? So we have to it's also about changing the narrative, seeing opportunities, for the companies. So, and we are quite grateful, Gary, for the companies that actually, are implementing real policies and, real and also outcomes focused and not just, compliance and ticking the box. So that's really what we're saying. We're saying there's an opportunity here, Gary, for companies to actually encourage and embrace gender equity, embrace women economic empowerment, because there's a benefit not just to the companies but also to the economy and to society as a whole. The minister has mentioned, the fact that gender-based violence impacts productivity, impacts, social stability, and as a result, it also increases absenteeism in the workplace. So there are so many benefits that companies actually, can gain from creating also spaces in their companies where gender-based violence is talked about, it's not a taboo, it's confronted, and there's accountability.
Deputy Minister, let's talk about the money. The cost of ensuring that gender-based violence is addressed is a constantly a pressing one. And within the presidency, in your portfolio, what is it that we know that the President included in the G20 and to G20 members to around the financing and innovative financing mechanisms and models to help unlock the resources needed to truly address the prevention of gender-based violence?
Yeah. No, Gary, no, it started also with the empowerment of women working group. 3 priorities were realized in the women's ministers or gender ministers session. 3 priorities. 1, financial inclusion. If we're going to turn around the trajectory of any of our countries in the G20, we have to make sure that women have got, equitable financial inclusion. Open the markets. Let women businesses, let women initiatives thrive. Let young people's initiative thrive if we want to see economic growth. You can imagine, it's not only just unique to South Africa alone, where the economic growth is very stubborn. Our economy is growing at 0.6%. We're supposed to be in a healthy bit, but it's stable, but it's growing in a snail pace. So the financial inclusion was one big part to saying that if you're going to open up credits, you're going to open markets, but make sure that it's accessible to women as well. The second part, it's the issue around the care economy. The unpaid labor is one big issue that we are dealing with across the G20. And we have to get to a point where we're costing every little cent it costs to take care of our own society, our own families. And at the highest is women who carry the burden of unpaid labor. So that was the second priority. The third one is GBV, and it's really about unlocking the potential of responding to gender-based violence. At the heart of it is prevention effort. And you would understand through using gender-responsive planning, auditing, monitoring and evaluation framework, which in this country we have. Treasury is dealing with it. Government is dealing with it to make sure that the framework is implemented across various departments. And you've heard even from private sector, where you are not only going to say how many women are employed as a tick box exercise. No, we then are saying they've got access to leadership, decision-making positions, but they also have access to initiate programs and lead. And we want to see it across sectors. So the gender-responsive framework is very important for the gender-based violence response. Every sector, social initiatives or departments, but also justice and economic departments have to embed that. One of the most important example, the pronouncement that also President Ramaphosa had made around the Procurement Act, where you're saying 40% must go towards women-led initiative, 30% must go towards youth-led initiative, and 7% towards persons with disability initiative. It's not a tick box exercise. It says that prepare these organizations, enterprises, so that they can compete equally and fairly in our economy. So that's how we unlock the money. Others, in terms of GBV response, it's added to then saying, what are these initiatives that you've invested in? If you take, we've got 66 Tutuzela Care Center. That's a response to then saying one-stop center, get health, get legal, get psychosocial support, and you must invest in it. But those are scalable effort to respond. We need to scale prevention.
Faith, if we can look at obviously another side of the financial burden of taking care of GBV in our society is that the fund has mobilized over 265 million rand since inception, but due to some global geopolitical shifts. You know, there have been a lot happening in the last year and a half, specifically in some funding mechanisms not, you know, being that we cannot count on automatically into the future. What is it that you're looking at in the 10-year beyond 2027 to address innovative financing mechanisms, you know, beyond traditional donations, etc., especially private sector environments looking at this interview or looking at this panel discussion, saying, what can we do? Tell us about those innovative mechanisms that you've been looking at.
Yes. So I think from the private sector perspective, you know, how they can continue to support the fund. We will really like the private sector to commit longer term, you know, funding, you know, to the fund. So that's sort of like the financial aspect of it. But also, Gary, the in-kind support is critical. You know, the skills transfer. And again, we are grateful right now because we've got a number of pro bono partners, you know, that continue to work with the fund. Also, you know, if we look at the BBB scorecard, you know, you've got various pillars there, being the, you know, socioeconomic pillar, skills development pillar. We believe that actually if corporates can, for example, allocate a specific percentage under socioeconomic development pillar to GBV related initiatives, that would really go a long way, because we are not asking corporates to allocate more funding, but we're saying that from the pie that they have, you know, can they allocate a certain percentage towards the GBV fund. So those are kind of conversations that we are having with the private sector. But also, I want to also say that international donor organizations continue to support the fund. So we are quite grateful for that. We know that USAID has withdrawn funding, but other development agencies from Europe continue to support the fund, and some of them have already committed longer-term funding to the fund, because we can demonstrate, Gary, the impact, the positive impact that we are making. You indicated earlier that we have reached more than 1 million beneficiaries, supporting survivors along the 6 pillars of the NSP. So this is, you know, how we are, you know, sort of like trying to be creative, and also trying not to appear as if we are burdening the private sector by asking, you know, for additional funding. We're saying that from the existing pot, allocate funding to GBV. But also we're saying, Gary, put in place initiatives that support women economic empowerment. You know, because we want to end GBV. So we want everyone to play a role in empowering women, because once women are empowered, they will be able to dictate their lives, their relationships, and they will obviously, you know, also be able to, you know, sustain their livelihood. So that's the conversation that we're having with our partners.
Deputy Minister, Sustainability. Let's so there was word at the G20 about consensus, broad consensus, but the one thing that everybody's unanimous about is that South Africa placed the issue of gender equality at the heart of the macroeconomic debate for the first time on African soil, and also on the G20 agenda going forward. And we've seen from the majority of the partners, there's broad-based consensus that it's really important, that it may be the one thing most people agree on in the roadmap forward. But what sort of accountability can we ensure from G20 members to keep GBVF on this in the spotlight?
Indeed. I think first is to appreciate that G20 is a consensus building space. So unlike when you look at you know, mechanisms such as the United Nations that are accountability infused, you know, where we report consistently so. But you are raising a fundamental point. What happens if you don't reach his target, because the targets and the importance of gender-based violence is not a lost conversation. We were intentional to bring it on board because that's the global data, our country datas, that are demonstrating who actually, anchors this burden of challenge of a social fabric that affects our society and tears our society apart. But we are meeting and having these conversations in G20 in the backdrop of global commitments. The SDGs, SDG 3, SDG 5, which are quite important and are linked to how we actually meet the gender parity. And it's quite important that countries show up. You see, if at all we are not going to just commit and act on the, we will be failing our citizens. There's a hope that, brought all these G20s as global economic powers to actually look at what is it that we can learn from each other, leverage from each other, but also how do we create a global economic stage that actually celebrates different economic growth, whether in the global north, global south. But what is key in all of these is that you build solidarity. Those countries that have the privilege of a developed world can extend that privilege to a developing world. And we've seen it for the first time. G20 happened in Africa, African soil, in South Africa. And we've brought intentional themes of solidarity, equality, and sustainability to say that Africa is not a bystander. South Africa is not going to also look at the rest of the world having this conversation without saying that we want to sit on the table. We are also contributing. And African countries have got a lot of mineral resources, and we want to be able to make sure that there's beneficiation to those who are coming from African countries. And that's why negotiations that you shouldn't be hitting African countries or global south countries with big tariff rates and so forth. Let's talk and negotiate where we all can celebrate our economies, including those in the global north. So those macroeconomic policies and interventions are key in consensus, but also in implementation.
Mr. Yu, at the G20, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Guterres, emphasized that Africa has been a double victim of colonialization, and that GBV is actually a long legacy of colonialism as well. How does the UNFPA advocate for stronger representation, first of all, and around issues like reproductive health and sexuality, and the rights of, especially in the voices for women on the global stage, but also not only particularly women, but about shaping policy and global policy around this? How do you address that?
I think this is a very powerful message from the UN Secretary General, and perhaps I can use South Africa, the collaboration in South Africa, as an example to share how we then demonstrate that. First and foremost is we directly partner with the institutions, organizations anchored in South Africa with a global vision. For example, the Global Leaders Network for Women, Children and Adolescents is actually chaired by His Excellency the President of South Africa. That he brought 10 presidents, head of states, to join that coalition. And this is the first Southern-led health diplomacy that we have ever seen in the global stage. So we do collaborate with organizations as such. And another example is I was in the shelter movement of South Africa in Dava last week. I made a comment and suggested to say that I look forward to see the next global forum to be hosted in South Africa. So we look forward to project the voice and capacity of South Africa in examples of showcasing service delivery models. And the second is around investing in women and youth leadership. Actually, I'm so proud to see the Sherpa of the Y20 was a member of the we called Youth Advisory Board of Unfpa, which is a 10-year-long program trying to nurture and capacitate women and youth leaders. So we're so happy to see them on the international stage. Last but not least, I mentioned about South-South collaboration. Actually, during the G20, we partner with the parliaments. There are more than 40 parliamentarians from the G20 countries, as well as from the African continent, signed a joint declaration for women's health. So these are important collaboration that puts Africa at the center of development.
Faith, it's really encouraging to hear all these moves. But so when you're looking at South Africa and the fund positioning itself as a South-South innovation template, is there great interest in your template or your blueprint in how to introduce funding models and to roll out the kind of projects that you have? Have any G20 countries or members expressed interest in how you do it? How have you done it so well?
Yes, we were actually quite privileged, and this is through the Minister and Unfpa, to have a stage during the G20 where we basically presented our model. And I think since then, I mean, we've been, for example, Kenya has indicated that they would like to learn more about our model and adopt the model. Mr. Yu mentioned Mauritius, so Mauritius as well is another country that has indicated interest. So we really are quite excited, Gary, that some of the G20 countries have seen that this model is quite robust and successful, because we all know that gender-based violence is a global problem. And I mean, you cited statistics about the impact of gender-based violence in SA GDP, but globally, Gary, the cost is estimated at $1.5 trillion, about 2% of the global GDP. So I think this is why, we really think that, this model has got legs. And we're looking forward to working with G20 members and, through, our other partners to really see how this model can be rolled out in those countries.
Deputy Minister, perhaps let's talk about the 16 days of activism, which really highlighted the situation, but under the theme Letsema, again focusing on promoting positive masculinity, and very often something not always dealt with and overlooked, but very, very much key to how we address gender-based violence and to encouraging men to challenge social norms. Why this focus?
Look, I think it was quite important for us to really launch the 16 days focusing also on men. First, we're saying that, women, this is not a women's issue. Gender-based violence is not a women's issue. But also, women can't do this alone. If you look at actually, some of the marches and protests and petitions that have been submitted over this last year, whether you're talking about work that was done by the ANC Women's League, Women for Change, Call to Action, it's women who are leading these movements, who are saying gender-based violence is affecting us. But we also know that gender-based violence, like patriarchy, affects men too. So we are then saying, let's actually invest our effort around positive masculinity. Certainly, Gary, we know that in our country, this beautiful country of ours, we still have men who cares, who protects, who contributes to the economy socially and politically. We want more of these men. But we're also saying, let's get this young boy to be a better man tomorrow. Let's not deal with a broken man later, because that's why it was an investment towards saying, expand and upscale efforts. Many institutions, government and civil society, including those that are supported by the fund, are working towards how we address these harmful practices that actually destroys our community. We are saying work with traditional leaders, work with faith leaders. These are two important institutions that are a social fabric in informing how society behaves and how it responds to its own population. But at the same time, we are saying that we need to respond to the harmful practices that also violates men. Whether you're dealing with substance use and abuse, mental health, you're dealing with dismantling patriarchy and misogyny. But you have to deal with it socially, in communities, but you also have to deal with it online. Because we cannot normalize soft violence online that goes unaccounted for. And these are some of the issues that when we lifted it, we had launched it together with the media, arts, and culture sector, because many people consume films, music, and even online content that actually contributes to some of the harmful practices.
Faith, can you perhaps share specific examples of where not only at national level, but breaking intergenerational cycles of violence, very much an underlying tone in the psychology that that plays out when it comes to gender-based violence, and which indicators do you track to measure whether or not communities are embracing or rebuilding trust, safety, and dignity?
Thanks, Gary. So some of the areas that we're focusing on to make sure that we start to break, this intergenerational violence is interventions in schools. So, we working, with community-based organizations that are actually, working in primary schools and high schools on the ground. So, for example, now, so when we look at the impact of the interventions, we look at like how many young people have actually attended, some of those interventions or training initiatives that are specifically speaking to to the issues that are impacting young people. So we've got anti-bullying initiatives, and also we make sure that we also address this online violence and harassment through our CBOs, because young people are really their lives is online, and we need to make sure that we go where the problems are and where the perpetrators are. So we work with community-based organizations like Community Keepers and Restoration of Hope, who are focusing on early childhood. We also work with men, because as the minister said, this GBV is not a women's problem. It's actually a societal problem, and men must, be proactively involved, and they must take accountability. So organizations like What About the Boys, which is led by Prime Stars, Ringham Jita, engage young men and boys so that they can be empowered, they can shift mindsets, and actually learn to respect themselves so that they can respect women. So What About the Boys, for example, has reached over 20,000 young men in schools since it was launched about 2 years ago, and we know that more can be done to actually reach more young boys. But also, Gary, there is a mentorship element that is required, to really make sure that we break, this intergenerational violence. So some of the CBOs then have got mentors that work with these young men, because this thing is not just like you can't solve it once off. You really have to have programs that are deep, that also continue to support women. And then lastly, women economic empowerment. So we work with community-based organizations that make sure that the Tutuzela centers are also used as places of development and growth. not just places of, women only go there just because, they want to be healed. Of course, they must be healed, but also then they must be empowered. So we work with companies that really bring these skills into those Thuthuzela centers so that we can start to train women. And again, we've seen, significant successes with those programs.
Minister, at a G20 breakfast, you were quoted as saying, and this was quite widely quoted, that no woman should be left behind, not by geography, ability, sexuality, or class. Powerful statement. What kind of interventions are the departments and the government already doing to address the unique vulnerabilities by rural women, specifically LGBTI persons, women with disabilities, etc. And so perhaps, and young mothers that face various forms of different kinds of discrimination. What is being done, and what are some of the touch points that we can already count on being dealt with?
Yeah. Look, Gary, our midterm development plan prioritizes a capable government in all spheres. It then means that we must, look at how we address intersectionality. And no doubt, and I think we are consistent around it. Our constitution requires that. Our policies requires that. Every department must serve people in all their diversity. And these services don't belong to urban areas alone. It means that a woman in Lusikisiki and a woman in Cape Flats or a woman in Soweto deserves the same equal services. So if you're totally talking about youth-friendly services that integrate sexual reproductive health and rights, we want that implemented everywhere across board. But if at all you're also talking about the work that is done by Justice Department that is focusing on the intervention strategy responding to the LGBTI issues, you want it across board. And even the white paper that we have introduced and passed as government, this is the white paper on the rights of persons with disability. No person with disability going into a facility must struggle or to communicate. We have a sign language as the official 12th language of this country. It means that we speed up interventions, train, sensitize to end discrimination, to end stigmatization, and we are very much committed to that agenda as the government of the day under the leadership of President Ramaphosa.
Mr. if we can perhaps, then quickly jump to an issue that many people wouldn't necessarily realize sits at the junction of gender-based violence and femicide and economic activity, etc., but climate justice. So the G20 and was particular at looking at that, and the Unfpa has dealt with climate justice and gender-based violence being, actually something that needs to be dealt with together.
Absolutely. Actually, UNFPA projects that, in the worst scenario with a rising emission, the survival of the interpersonal intimate partner violence could triple, actually, by 2060 in the Sahara Africa. Therefore, our response has been focused a lot on direct humanitarian response and supporting the survivors in terms of prevention and service delivery. Actually, in 2023, we spent about $500 million in supporting those survivors in humanitarian situation and context, especially including those climate-induced disasters, and reaching close to 6-7 million survivors. We are also supporting the member states in strengthen preparedness and resilience building. And for example, we have a minimum initial service package, and that is the standard that the member states can apply in addressing and prepare themselves in responding to such a crisis. Last but not least, we join partners in advocating for increased development financing. It is estimated only 0.04% of the climate development financing goes to women empowerment and GBV response, which is insignificant, which is too low. So we join partners to say that let's collectively increase that investment. Yeah.
Faith, then perhaps before we come to closing statements, from our esteemed panel, 123 years is what they tell us it will take to deal with gender-based violence, and as a timeline. But what specific interventions can, for instance, the GBVF fund, response fund do, and all other partners, whether it's global or local or national or regional or at community level, to accelerate this timeline? How do we measure these programs and get to actually, shifting the timeline and saying, and the urgency around this?
First of all, I think we definitely must not accept the 123 years, Gary, because that is just, as humanity, we have advanced so much in many ways, but we just don't want to deal with this, gender parity issue. So I think for me, that is the first call. The second call is that we have to continue to scale our partnerships and interventions and actually create a South Africa-wide movement, to empower women and to end gender-based violence. We have an economy that is growing at less than 1% per annum. And we know that one of the reasons is because we've got 51% of our population, which is women, not participating meaningfully in this economy. So I think if we can create this movement of women empowerment, ending gender-based violence, and really opening up opportunities for women, opening up businesses for women, we can actually go a long way towards creating a society that is inclusive, that values both men and women, and that actually can then work towards, ending this gender parity and gender-based violence before, the 123 years that we've seen. And I think the fund, Gary, has demonstrated the power of collaboration, the power of strategic partnerships, and the power of accountability, because we need accountability from each partner. So I think it's time that, we also use the opportunity that, the President has classified GBV as a national disaster to actually get together and say, let us create a movement. Let us see the positives of empowering women and ending gender parity gaps.
Final closing statements, everybody. Let's bring these final reflections to the fore. Deputy Minister, with all the stuff that we've discussed and sustained investment required to turn out a shared vision, ending GBVF in our lifetime, what's the answer?
I think it's possible. We do demonstrate as South Africa that we can turn around some of the trajectories. We can thrive. We can come together. First, it's really about making sure that it stops. Prevention is the biggest achievement we can get to. And if all parties come together, that prevention element is key. But it also then says men must stand up and must rise to stop end gender-based violence, end violence against children, and also end violence against vulnerable groups. So it then also goes to the investment. GBV response or prevention is not an event. It's not just this symbolic activity. It's a system of dismantling inequality, dismantling patriarchy, but also getting a nation coming together. So my view is that we are courageous South Africans, we can unite, and we can end it.
Mr. Yu, perhaps a closing statement around how can individuals, communities, companies, and really address this globally?
Thank you. I believe it all starts with me and now. Actually, the United Nations has a system-wide program called PSEA, Prevention of Sexual Exploitation and Abuse, and that sets the highest standard for us as an international civil service, so that we become a role model in the office, at home, in the community, and with our partners. And to conclude, I think it's very important to bring out the excellent work the department and the leadership of the minister, deputy minister, around the reflective review of the 5 years implementation of the NSP for GBVF. Actually, it pointed out three interesting points. One, the first is around financing. It shows that there's inadequate financing to implement the NSP. And second is implementation. It points out that there's a fragmentation in the multi-sectoral service delivery, in the family, in the community. Last but not least, it talks about accountability, as Faith highlighted. And it's kind of alarming to say, as a conclusion from that review, says there's a low trust between the society and the state. And so that, this also reflects the issue of financing as well in implementation. But as Honourable Minister said, that the report also concluded, actually out of 170 indicators, close to 90% are achieved or are in progress. So with such level of political will and commitment, strong institutions, strategic partnership, and innovation such as GBVF Fund, I believe we will make it.
Faith, perhaps final word, just from declaration to sustainable change.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also hopeful, Gary, because I can see that, finally there's an alignment between a sense of agency, political will, community action, and private sector commitment. So I really believe that we are at that inflection point where together we can really end GBV. So from my side, I want to urge all of us also to embrace Ubuntu. Yeah. And we must choose humanity, respect, and dignity for all. Thank you very much.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us on this fantastic panel. Thank you to our distinguished panelists for this critical conversation. Let me be clear about what we've heard today. Every 3 hours, a woman dies in South Africa. Not in some distant statistic, but in our neighborhoods, our workplaces, our homes. Every single day we delay action. 15 more women lose their lives. Every year we treat this as business as usual. We bankrupt our economy by over 100 million rand. Every day we wait for someone else to act. We tell our daughters their safety is negotiable. The President has made the declaration, the funding models exist, the partnerships are forming, the global spotlight is on us. The only question that remains is, what will you do? If you're a business leader, contact the GBVF Response Fund and join the private sector coalition. And embed zero tolerance policies. Make positive masculinity a boardroom imperative, not a buzzword. If you're in civil society, hold us accountable. Keep marching, keep demanding, keep reminding us that silence is complicity. And if you're watching at home, break the silence, challenge the jokes, call out the behavior, teach your sons that strength is measured in compassion, not control. Support the survivors in your life, donate to the organizations doing the work, because here's the truth. A girl born today should not have to wait 123 years for equality. She should not have to live in fear. She should not inherit our future. What we need is the will, not tomorrow, not next quarter, not after the next election, now, because every 3 hours, another clock is ticking, and for one woman in South Africa, time has just run out. For more information on how to get involved, visit the GBVF Response Fund at www.gbvfresponsefund1.org. Contact the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities, or reach out to the Unfpa South Africa. This is not someone else's fight, this is our fight, and it starts now. To our panel, thank you very much for joining us, and to our viewers, thank you for watching.